Lord, we do indeed thank you for the cross. We thank you that before you even created the world, you knew that you would send your Son into it to save us. And we thank you that that is an accomplished fact, and now your Son has sent your Holy Spirit into the world to be with us and in us and around us, to guide us and comfort us and to lead us in your paths. So God, we ask that you would use the text that we're going to look at today, empowered by your Holy Spirit, to fill us with your Spirit and help us to see what you're doing in the world. Then God, please cause our hearts to come alive so that we can chase after it with the rest of our lives. And we pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. A cricket found himself particularly excited about a very sweet blade of grass that he was munching on. And in his excitement, he scraped his legs together for the loudest chirp he'd ever chirped in his whole life. A water buffalo, lazily munching on a similar bunch of grass not too far away, heard this chirp and yelled, "It's gonna get us! Run!" And as the shocking news of impending doom rippled through the entire herd, everybody started to run. Hearts pounding, eyes wide open, tongues hanging out. You're in the middle of this. Running with the herd, jockeying for position, and you're exhausted and you're strained until you can't stand it anymore. And you finally yell, "Stop! Just stop already! Why are we running? Goodness, we're kicking up such a cloud of dust. We can't see where we're going. We can't see and enjoy anything around us. We don't even know that 300 yards ahead is a cliff. If we keep stampeding in the same direction, we're running to our own destruction. Why are we running? We've got to consider what we're doing. We've got to change our course. We've got to wonder, do we really want to spend the rest of our lives running with a herd in a stampede towards a cliff? As for me, I am out. I'm going to stop. I'm going to go over and maybe smell that flower. I'm going to lay down in the grass and think about my life. I'm going to look up at the stars and wonder who made them. I'm going to take time and figure out exactly what I was designed to do. And then I'm going to spend the rest of my life doing that. As everybody patiently listens to your impassioned speech, some guy in the back yells, "Run!" And everybody starts and the whole thing is off again. But you're out. You and a few others who wonder if there's something more to life than this. Have you ever wondered, is there more to life than what I'm living? Have you ever just stopped in your tracks and asked, why am I running? I'm kicking up so much dust, I can't see where I'm going. I can't enjoy the things that are around me. I just feel like my life is moving as one with the herd. Is there possibly some uniquely created spark inside of me that I ought to be taking time to fan into flame and use that for that thing that I'm supposed to be doing? Anyone? Just me? I think we stop and wonder that from time to time. Today we are actually in our 7th sermon in this Sabbath series that I've been kind of preaching since about the middle of February. And today we're going to watch as the Psalmist in Psalm 92 talks about Sabbath and ties that beautifully into finding your calling in life. Psalm 92 is labeled, so in the NIV it says Psalm 92, then there's the little letters under it. Sometimes it's like of David or play with this instrument. This one says Psalm 92, a psalm, a song for the Sabbath day. So this is the only psalm in the entire Psalter that is labeled as for the Sabbath day. So this is a psalm that is going to help us to be able to discern what is our calling in life. We've been saying for weeks and weeks now that on the Sabbath is given to us as one of God's most beautifully designed gifts. It is a day for ceasing our work and our worry and our drive to create and achieve and produce. It is a day for resting our minds and our hearts and our spirits and our bodies and our souls. It's a day for embracing all the things of God, His Word and His Spirit. It's a day for bending my life, bending our lives away from themselves and towards other people. It is also a day that is critical in finding what our calling in life is. So I just want you to remember that the label for this psalm is a psalm for the Sabbath day. That's going to be running in the background of everything that we talk about. And remember, if you haven't, you can grab the sermon notes or watch the sermons online to kind of bring yourself up to speed. But today is diving into Psalm 92 and seeing how the psalmist helps us to find our calling. So this is how he begins, verses 1 through 3. He writes, "It is good to praise the Lord and make music to your name, O Most High, proclaiming your love in the morning and your faithfulness at night, to the music of the 10-stringed lyre and the melody of the harp." The psalmist says, so on the Sabbath day, one of the most important things that we do is we gather together and we combine our hearts and our minds as one, and we lift them up to God together. And he says, we do this to music. Why? Why is it that music has such a strong effect on us? If the praise team didn't have lemon in their water, and so they said, we're not playing today, there's no lemon for our water. They took the day off, and we were reduced to just reciting the words. So instead of music playing, we just recited all of the words in the songs without music. It wouldn't do nearly the same thing, would it? There's just something about music that gives our words wings. So in the morning, we gather together, and collectively, our hearts and our minds come together, and we lift them up to God on the wings of music. And there's just something special about that. It's hard to put words to it. Even the psalmist, he says, we come together, we sing, we lift our hearts to God, and then basically all he can say about it is good. Even he's at a loss for words. But it is good. There is just something about gathering together and having our hearts lifted to God in music. It sets something straight. He says to God, O Most High. It's just coming together and saying, God, you are big, and we are very small, and you really, really love us. It is good. There's just something about this that corrects our perspective and kind of clears away the junk in life and just allows us to see things more clearly. So even the psalmist, probably 3,000 years ago, said, coming together and singing to God. There is just something amazing about that. So that is how we start our day. Our vision is clarified, our hearts and minds are aligned and lifted up to God. And then he goes on in verses 4 through 7, "For you make me glad by your deeds, Lord. I sing for joy at the work of your hands. How great are your works, Lord. How profound your thoughts. Senseless people do not know. Fools do not understand. I'm going to start with that last statement, and then that's kind of the negative side of the coin, and then we'll flip over to the positive side. But he's saying on the Sabbath day, when we gather and our hearts and minds collect and we lift them up to God, that gives us the ability to look out into the world and see what God is doing. Right? When we're running as one with the herd, and our life is just like in a stampede, and we're kicking up dust, and we don't know where we're going, we can't see what's around us, our senses are numb, and we don't have the ability to see what it is that God is doing, what the works of his hands are, the directions that he's going. And the psalmist says, senseless people, people that are so in the blinding flow of life that they have lost their ability to sense these things. They can't see them. And fools do not understand. The psalmist goes on to say that those who do the opposite of what God instructs, their lives lead to destruction. So it is just like being a stampeding water buffalo in the mass. You have no idea where you're going, but you're just running. Eventually, we're going to run straight over a cliff. So the psalmist is saying senseless people don't have the ability to see these things because they never stop. They're always running all the time with the herd. But on the other side, he says God's people, now remember, this is a psalm for the Sabbath. So he's saying God's people on the Sabbath, when they cease just one day out of 7, stop everything that they're doing and rest and embrace the things of God and take a day to bend their lives away from themselves and towards others. We have the ability to look out into the world and see what God is doing all of a sudden. And that is part of what this day is. It is a day to stop what we're doing and a day to look out and to see what God is doing. And I know that I need that. I mean, this was just, I was chewing on this all week, that it is so easy to get so wrapped up in my projects and my life and my problems and this, and everything is just focused in. But what a gift to be able to just take one day out of 7 and set all of that aside and look up and out into the world and see all the things that God is doing. It gives us the ability to recognize that our lives are being lived to a much larger purpose. When the psalmist says, when I see your deeds, they make me glad. When I look at what your hands have done, there's just something inside of me that wants to begin to sing. So what has God done? I was just talking to Andy, and one of our favorite parts of Sunday mornings is when Aaron is up here and calls the kids forward. And everybody comes, running and waddling and skipping and dancing, and they're just, all up here being these wonderful little kids. And there's just something about that that's amazing. We see the work of God's hands, and it just bubbles joy inside of us. So this is a day for looking at what God has done and letting our gladness come out and take over and to rejoice in that. This morning, from where we live, there was this gorgeous fog over the town. So there was just hints of blue sky, green grass, fog, and then the sun rises, and the light just begins to slowly creep and cascade over everything. And it's just the most beautiful thing in the world. And when the sun sets, guess what? It does the same thing in reverse. It's awesome, and God does that every day. This is a day for stopping what we're doing. For heaven's sake, stop what you're doing and look and see what God is all about. And let it cause your heart to sing. The psalmist says, I look at what God does and he makes me glad. I look at the works of his hands and it brings me joy. How profound are his thoughts. It's also a day for looking out and stepping back and seeing the larger picture. Because when we're so wrapped up and our vision is right in here, Becca got on us this morning. John and Luke and I were walking in and we're talking and we all had our heads down like this. And she's like, oh, you guys are all staring at the ground. It's like, oh, you're right. Lift up, right? Chin up. Look out, lift your eyes up and see what God is doing. When we step back and we look at a broader scope, right, and we trust that God exists and that He's working for our good, all of a sudden, on the Sabbath day, when we step back, we can see Him beginning to weave together all these larger themes in our life. And we can look back and see something that felt horrible at the time, but now that we're past it, we can see how our life would not be the same today if that did not happen to us. That was necessary. But if we're so caught and wrapped up in ourselves, we just stay mad about that all the time. So the psalmist is saying it's a day for just realizing that God's thoughts are enormous and they're profound. It gives us a larger perspective on life. So the benefits of living into the Sabbath are enormous. And just to state the obvious, we have to stop in order to see these things. The Sabbath is one of the greatest gifts that God has ever given to us. We don't do it for Him. He's not going to keep a logbook of, have you kept the Sabbath today? He does this for us because He knows that we need it. In order for us to have the benefits of everything that the psalmist just said, we have to stop. And we have to look out from ourselves and see what God is doing. So now we're going to bend a little more directly into looking at what the psalmist says about finding our calling. And so everything that we've said this far is really building the foundation for it. So when it comes to a person finding her calling or finding his calling in life, there's kind of a chicken and egg thing that goes on. So Aaron and I have been thinking this kind of thing through for a very long time, all the way back to when we were in seminary, just trying to figure out what God's calling us to do. What is our calling in life? What do you want me to do? Where do you want us to go? All of this stuff, right? What we've noticed over the course of time is that most of the time when a person is looking for God's calling, what we do is we stop and we look inside of ourselves and we try to figure out, what is the gift that God gave me? I'm trying to find it, I'm trying to see it, I'm looking inside, I can't piece it all together. What does God want me to do with my life? And there's two very obvious things that are going on right here. One is that we're gazing inside of ourselves, trying to figure out, piece everything together, what does God want me to do? The other is that we have stopped movement, right? When we talk to people who are like, what does God want me to do with my life? Most of the time, we are stopped and gazing into ourselves, trying to figure this out. Well, what is the psalmist telling us instead? That we are to look out into the world and to see what God is doing. So we look out with the intent of seeing what God is doing in the world, seeing His works, piecing together His thoughts, seeing how He is weaving all of these gigantic, beautiful things together. So looking for our calling in life, we have a tendency to stand still and gaze inside of ourselves, whereas the psalmist is saying that we are to look up and look out and begin by seeing what God is doing out in the world. What are His works? What are His hands doing? What are His deeds? And that is where we begin. One of the most significant, non-biblical, but it's based on the Bible, but non-biblical quotes that has ever affected me is we were in seminary and our mentor, pastor, preached a sermon and he read this quote that I'm about to read you. And for me, it shifted everything because I had never thought about it that way before. We spent 3 years looking inside of ourselves, trying to figure out what is my calling? What are you asking me specifically to do and where do you want me to go? So the quote is this. It's a man who wrote a book called The Mustard Seed Conspiracy, and his name is Sine. And he writes, "We ask the wrong question if we search for God's will in our lives. We should instead see what God is doing in the world and become a part of his program." So I'm just going to take a breath, and I'm going to read that again and just allow that to sink in. This is based to a large part on what the psalmist is saying. That we ask the wrong question if we search for what God's will is in our lives. We should instead see what God is doing in the world and become a part of his program. So we ought to be looking out in the world and asking, what is God doing? Back in the Old Testament, the prophet Micah, God spoke through Micah, and the people were like, "What do you want us to do? Do you want more sacrifices? Do you want more animals, sacrifice? Do you want more olive oil? Do you want more sheep? Do you want more cattle? What do you want?" And God spoke through Micah, and he said, "I have already told you what I want and what I require from you. And that is to do justly, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." So when we look out into the world, what is God doing? And whatever it is that you're involved in, whether it's a business or just interpersonal stuff, always do justly. Always do the right thing. So when you're, "God, what do you want me to do?" I want you to do the right thing by me every time. Do you know how big of a blessing that would be to the people around you? Not only that, he says through Micah, but look out and what kind of kindness is happening in the world. He says, love kindness. When you see something that is just an amazing blessing to other people, if your heart is moved by that, go and be a part of that. Go and do the same thing. In the New Testament and the Old Testament, it's like, Jesus talks about caring for widows and orphans. What is happening out in the world if there is a kid that, a child that doesn't have the opportunity to have a loving household and parents, and God has moved your heart to bring them into your home? That is what God is asking you to do in life. If there is an older person who doesn't have the means to care for themselves, go and do that. Jesus says when somebody is hungry, go and find a way to feed them. If somebody doesn't have enough clothes for the winter, go and find a way to wrap them in something warm. If somebody is hopeless, go and bring hope into their life. There's 1,011 ways to go out and to love the people around us. So God, what are you doing in the world? Anything that is God-loving people, that is what he is doing. So Tom Sine in his quote, "Gosh, God, what do you want me to do in life? What is your will for me?" We ought to instead see what God is doing in the world and go and become a part of his program. In a way, that can be a very releasing thing for us, because we really can get stressed out about what God specifically wants me to do. And then we stop movement and we sit there and we wonder, chicken and egg. Do we first figure out what God is calling me to do before I get my butt off the couch and go do something? Or do I go and start working at whatever God happens to be doing, and then my sense of call happens on the fly? I think biblically it happens a lot more the second way. There's always the Moses, this is what I want you to do. David, you're the next king. Abraham, you got to move east. I'm going to show you this place. It's going to be great. But that's Moses and David and Abraham. For everybody else, it was love God and love the people around you. Find ways to creatively do that. So what is our calling in life? The psalmist says, look out at the deeds that God is doing, what his hands are working on, what he's thinking about, and go and do those things. But we also want to ask, can it get more specific than that? So, yes, I get that. That's good. But can it be more specific? And here's another quote that really was a life-changing thing for me. Frederick Buechner talks about recognizing God's calling in your life. And I want you to also hear the reflection back into Psalm 92. And this is what Buechner says. The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. So first, just listen back to the reflection from Psalm 92, that I see your deeds and they make me glad. I see what your hands are doing and joy bubbles up on the inside of me. There's this connection between what God is doing and what stirs our heart. And what Buechner is saying is, when you're looking for God, what do you want me to do? It's looking out into the world and seeing what God is doing. And then looking inside briefly to see what stirs your heart and what brings you joy and what works that deep gladness inside of you. And there's a very good possibility that that is the thing that God is asking for you to do. Because God has given every single person whom he calls, Paul says, a gift. And that gift is to be used to do the things of God in the world. So, where's that place that you're called to? It is where your deep gladness and the world's deep hurt meet. That is probably the place that God is calling you to. So we turn the corner briefly, and there's just a couple other things that are going to kind of firm this up. We've talked so far about seeing God's deeds and his works, but the psalm ends with kind of a rolling up the sleeves, and now let's go and do. So verse 10, the psalmist writes, "So you have exalted my horn like that of a wild ox. Fine oils have been poured on me." So this is symbolic language, and when we dissect it, a horn is a biblical symbol for strength. So anytime you see someone talk about a horn, it means strength. So when God has called us, to look out into the world and see what he is doing, when the psalmist says, "You have exalted my horn like that of a wild ox," he's saying that I have given you the strength to go and do what is needed. So to go and do something about it, God provides the strength. And oil poured over our heads. In the Old Testament, oil was used for commissioning people for special purposes. So priests were anointed with oil, and kings were anointed with oil. And as we said, Paul said, everybody has a gift. So commissioned for God's special purposes. And oil is also a symbol of God's flowing blessings. So when God shows us what he's doing, verse 10 says he's given us the strength and the commissioning and the blessing to now go and do something with it. And the psalm finishes with, "The righteous will flourish like a palm tree." And a palm tree is one that continues to bear fruit. "And they will grow like a cedar of Lebanon," which means they will grow in strength. "Planted in the house of the Lord, they will flourish in the courts of our God. And they will still bear fruit in old age, staying fresh and green." The psalmist is saying that when we plant ourselves in the courts of God, even as we begin to grow old, there is going to be a joy and the opportunity for a continued purpose in our lives. So now to kind of tie all of this together. For one day a week, right, the psalm for the Sabbath. For one day a week, let's step out of the stampede and look into the world and see what God is doing there. And then briefly look inside of ourselves and see what particular joys and gifts God has placed there. then let's bend those joys and gifts in God's direction, or in the direction of what He's already doing, and then resume our movement. And then we should smile a little, because God is at work, and we are involved, and there is no better place to be. Let us pray. God, we thank you for the wisdom of the Psalmist. And we thank you that in such a beautiful way he has pointed out to us all of these beautiful things that we can glean by really pouring ourselves into keeping the Sabbath day. And we ask that you would give us the eyes to see what you are doing in the world, and then the heart to want to go after it, to partner with you in your mission, to love people. And we pray this all in Jesus' name.
Would you please stand?
Last week, Mike talked about the hole in our heart that only Jesus can fill. This last song we're going to sing is called Jesus, Only Jesus. This weekend, Mike and I stepped away from the stampede of baseball games and chorus concerts and keeping up with our 3 kids to be at a wedding. And there's nothing more special than being able to officiate a wedding. I stood up there and watched as the bride came down the aisle with her dad. And I watched the groom. That's my favorite thing to do. Do that at the next wedding you go to. The groom's eyes were so full of tears, he was trying not to blink if they were going to spill. I saw God at work in that moment. And then as they turned to face each other to do their vows, there was one lone tear that couldn't take it anymore and just started to travel down his cheek, down his chin, dripped onto his tie, and fell all the way down. The look in his eyes when he looked at his bride was the most beautiful thing I had seen in a long time. That's how God looks at you. That's how much he loves you. Take time this week to look at him, to Sabbath, to see how he's at work, because only God can love you that much. Jesus, only Jesus. May you be blessed with his love. Amen.
The